Welcome everyone, Shio, hello in Cherokee, as we learned from our adventure session with Cherokee Elder Gil Jackson last year. We are so excited to offer this adventure series geared for young people, engaging for all ages. I'm Chloe DeCamera with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, based on native Cherokee lands, also known as Asheville, North Carolina, with my amazing colleagues on the line, Katherine, Julie, Alyssa, and Vaughn. Last year, we pivoted our regular education workshops for teachers and transformed them into virtual education sessions. This year, we are exploring cultural heritage, social and natural history along the AT and throughout public lands in the United States and across the globe. This series will cover a wide range of topics, from how heritage and history can be expressed through art and creative writing to the importance of acknowledging native lands. These sessions are a resource for educators, for students, for parents and guardians, and anyone interested in learning more about these topics. So a little bit about the Appalachian Trail. Many of you know about the AT and that it's a unit of the National Park System and a hiking trail that goes through 14 states from Georgia to Maine. It was built and completed by volunteers in 1937 and continues to be maintained by over 6,000 volunteers today. Our organization at ATC is a nonprofit that works with hundreds of partners, including land management agencies, volunteer-led clubs, partner organizations, including nonprofits and universities, and of course, communities along the stretch of the AT. We are so excited to have speakers throughout this adventure series teach us more about different aspects of the trail, from hiking, history, recreation, and plants and animals, and the powerful healing that can come from walking. I am particularly excited to introduce our two speakers for today because I feel as if my story with the AT has finally come full circle. Currently, I wear multiple hats for the ATC, including supervising volunteers who coordinate communication among AT communities, like Sarah does in North Georgia. But before I started working for the ATC, I was a religious studies major in college, and I was lucky enough to find an advisor in Dr. Kate Zubko, who took a particular interest in her students' success. While writing my senior thesis on religion and the Appalachian Trail, I ran into Dr. Zubko at a coffee shop, and she encouraged me to read a book called Becoming Odessa by Jennifer Farr Davis. Dr. Zubko used this book as a primary source for her freshman orientation course on pilgrimages. Unbeknownst to her, that book set me on a course that led me to through hike the AT in 2015 in a 7-year career in conservation, for which I am forever grateful. So without further ado, let me introduce our amazing instructors, then pass the mic to them. Sarah Adams grew up in Dahlonega, Georgia, and serves as ATC's North Georgia Community Coordinator. Spending time outdoors through hiking, birding, and gardening shaped her interest in the natural environment and human relationships to it. At Yale University, she majored in environmental studies. Her senior thesis examined cross-cultural connections between the Appalachian Trail and the Shinetsu Trail in Japan, and she is interested in building stronger relationships between people and the Appalachian Trail through unique connections to history, culture, and other ties in the region. Dr. Katherine Zubko is a professor of religious studies, interim director of humanities program, and NEH Distinguished Professor of Humanities at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. Her areas of expertise include aesthetics, ritual, performance, and embodied religion in South Asia. Dr. Zubko's most recent published work, co-edited with George Patty, is the volume titled Transformational Embodiment in Asian Religions, Subtle Bodies and Spatial Bodies. She also serves as the general editor of Equinox's interdisciplinary journal, and Body and Religion. So sit back and enjoy the fascinating look into pilgrimages and trails throughout the world.
Great. Thank you so much, Chloe, for those introductions. Really excited to be here with everyone and to talk with Dr. Zubko too about the Braj Yatra. I'll be talking about Japan's Shinetsu Trail. The Shinetsu Trail was Japan's first nationally funded trail in a similar way that the Appalachian Trail is nationally funded, and it was established in 2008. It's located in eastern Japan between the Nagano and the Niigata prefectures in the Sakita mountain range. And it was originally 80 kilometers long. That's the length that I hiked it when I hiked it during the summer of 2019 in preparation for my thesis about it. But it was actually recently extended to 120 kilometers long. And so we'll take a look at a map in a second. And again, there's a lot of connections to the Appalachian Trail, of course, because it was partially modeled after it. So I'll talk more about that in a second. This is the location of the Shinetsu Trail for the 80-kilometer portion that I hiked. And the photo below is from one of the sections of the Shinetsu Trail in the Numanohara wetlands, I believe. Next slide. Okay, and here is the extended Shinetsu Trail, which was actually completed this past fall in 2020. And so it now goes all the way to Mount Naeva, making it 120 kilometers long. And that was actually in the original vision for the Shinetsu Trail. So it's a huge way for the Shinetsu Trail to reach its completed vision that the lead founder Katonori Yoshi had for it. So congratulations to them.
All right, so I am also honored to be here. I'm going to go ahead and do some introduction to the Braj Yatra, which is a pilgrimage trail in India. And part of what we're going to be setting up today is just do a little bit of information, and then we're going to ask some questions to folks, and then we're going to interact and give a little bit more information about the trails and pilgrimages that we're introducing just here in the beginning. I also just want to acknowledge the Aniketu Wage, which is also known as the Cherokee, and that's the land that I live and work on. And I'm really grateful to continue to learn from, especially the Eastern Band of Cherokee, which are just down the road from us at UNC Asheville. Okay, so the Braj Yatra, just in brief here, is a approximately 168-mile pilgrimage that is connected to a Hindu devotional tradition, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment. It goes by a lot of different names. Braj is kind of a regional area that, if you see on the map there with India, comes between Delhi and Agra and Jaipur, which is often referred to as kind of the North Indian Triangle. These are really famous cities that people, especially when they go on tour, will go between those points. So Braj kind of sits in the middle of them. Braj is kind of known for having 12 forests in particular that are connected to the Hindu god Krishna. When people walk this trail, and you'll see in the map to the right, it is actually a circular trail, which is a little bit maybe unusual, but not in India. It's very usual to have circular routes, in part because that's connected to devotional practices, in which by circling an image, circling a town, circling a person, it's a way to honor and respect them. So in some ways, circles are fully embedded in all sorts of ritual traditions in India, including pilgrimages. So in the map on the right, you actually also have a two-line trajectory a little bit to the right, kind of like parallel. That's actually the river Yamuna, which is also connected to the Hindu god Krishna. And where most people start this trail is in a city that's just right by the river, about midway kind of up on your page, called Vrindavan. And so they'll start in Vrindavan, and then you'll take a circular clockwise route all the way around. It takes most people about a month. Many will do it barefoot as part of a devotional act as well. There are longer versions of this in which people will actually kind of take the shape of a lotus. So they'll take little kind of trajectories out as a leaf and come back, and a petal and come back. And it kind of turns it into a 300-mile version instead of a 168-mile version. One thing to know about Braj is that it probably started as more of an imaginary space, a visualized space for meditation, in which the god Krishna had acted and interacted with people and his devotees on that particular kind of imagined map. And that in the 16th century, so this is a very old tradition, a person, a Hindu devotee by the name of Narayan Bhatt, actually took those oral traditions and stories of Krishna and laid out the pilgrimage pathway, marking where different particular actions happened in the stories of Krishna. So this is the Hindu god, an image of the Hindu god Krishna. And he is very well, a lot of Hindu devotees are very much devoted to Krishna in particular, because he has activities that happened when he was a young child. You'll see there an image of him and his mother Yashoda. He was very mischievous. He would get into lots of trouble, and he really loved buttermilk. So he would constantly get into the buttermilk and make a mess in the house, and was constantly kind of very much a very naughty boy. And then as he grows up, he also becomes, as you see in the other image, a cow herder, and he is known for having a flute, and that flute is very intoxicating to his devotees. They are drawn to him and yearn to spend time with him, with that sound of the flute calling them to the forests in order to engage with him. And so the last thing I'll say before I open this up for our first question is that there's one very special cow herder, cow herdess, actually. Cow herdesses are called gopis, who that he forms a very special relationship with, and her name is Radha. So a lot of what you'll see on the pilgrimage trail are places in which he interacted with Radha, where they bathed and where he massaged her feet. And a lot of this devotional kinds of components are very much about creating affection and intimacy within a relational kind of format. And so this is the model of what would be called lover beloved, a form of Hindu devotional mysticism. And I'll say more about that later. We'd like to just see a little bit about who's in the room here. Welcome to everyone, especially our international folks. We just wanted to see if you'd like to put in the chat maybe some of the purposes that you see long trails and pilgrimages serving, whether it's something you've experienced yourself or that you've heard in connection with other types of long trails. So I'll give you a moment to put some ideas in the chat. Okay, great. I'm seeing some great ideas coming in. Things about walking meditation, a lot of things about connection, whether it's to source or nature, opportunities for transitioning between different chapters of one's life, different kinds of ways to create space for self-reflection. Oh, so many wonderful things that long trails help us to do, and really deepen that, especially those connections, whether it's with cultural heritage or ourself or source or other types of things we're working through in our lives at the moment. So self-discovery, I see that from Katherine. Thank you. So I'm just going to pass this back to Sarah, and she's going to speak a little bit to how the Shinetsu Trail, what purposes are connected to that trail.
Great, thanks, Kate, and thank you everyone for all of your responses, because many of them are connected to some of our discussion to come, I'm sure. So I think the easiest way, to find purposes to a long trail or pilgrimage trail is to go back in history to see how the trail got started in the first place. So that's what I'm going to do with the Shinetsu Trail to begin with. And after World War II, Japan experienced a post-war, quote, economic miracle. And so many people left rural areas, and pictured here is actually Iyama, which is the city that the Shinetsu Trail Club headquarters are based in today. Very rural area. And there used to be more people who lived there, but after the war, because Japan's economy took off, they moved to cities, to places like Tokyo and Osaka. And so suddenly these small towns are left with a lot fewer people, and they're facing a challenge for sustaining themselves for future generations economically and in many other ways. So the national government saw this challenge, and one approach they took to solving it was creating funding for rural revitalization projects, particularly through green tourism. And so green tourism is defined as sustainably focused tourism projects in rural areas. And so the city of Iyama actually decided that they might try to submit a project idea for building a trail that went through the local mountains there, like I mentioned, the Sakita Mountains. And so the image below is of the mayor of Iyama at the time, Koyama Kunitake. And so he eventually became the chair of the commission that was put in charge of creating the trail. Great. And so when we look at that sort of shift that happened in Japan, the post-war era, people moving to cities, that didn't happen all too long ago. But actually, for the Appalachian Trail too, there's a similar backstory that spurred Benton Mackay to create the Appalachian Trail. And so the Appalachian Trail, which was established in 1937, kind of came out of this time when industrialization was taking place, and it's called the second industrial revolution in some places, where there's electrification, assembly line production, like with the Ford cars, and a lot of logging happening in rural areas that were being transformed into raw materials for the US to become a global power. And overall, a lot more consumerism developing and people moving from rural areas to cities. And so there are many of the same pressures that were taking place in the US as was taking place in Japan that the Shinetsu Trail and both the Appalachian Trail are responding to. And so Benton Mackay, who is a landscape architect, envisioned the Appalachian Trail as this source of regional development that would provide room for both work, recreation, mental and physical recuperation, natural resource conservation, and employment. So I'm just going to briefly bring up Kato Noriyoshi, founder of the Shinetsu Trail, and in his writings that I read, he had a lot of the similar ideas that Benton Mackay had in their visions for their respective long trails. And so I'll speak more about Kato later on, but this is a picture of my family with Kato Noriyoshi and some other members of the Shinetsu Trail Club. And so that's where I have a personal connection to the Shinetsu Trail Club and some of the people who helped found it. So they inspired me to do some of the research that I'll be sharing with you all in today's discussion. And I'll pass it along to Kate for now, but excited to talk more with everyone.
So I just want to start with what Delia put in the chat about pilgrimages, that you meet people that kind of talk about a sacred intent, whatever that's defined. And I'd say that's very much the case with the purposes of the Braj Yatra. This is a type of pilgrimage in which that type of devotional aspect is something connected to another term called Leela, or divine play in the world. So Krishna is considered to be an avatar of another god who comes down into human form to engage with his human devotees, as well as animals and all sorts of other creatures that he ends up spending time with. And so part of what this pilgrimage is doing is provides an opportunity for a devotee to engage in that divine play of Krishna. And so this is a very light-hearted kind of devotional practice. I think when people think about Hindu devotional practices, sometimes the thing that comes to mind is something called asceticism, where you think about yogis who are meditating, 24 hours a day and might be celibate and really very much engaged in practices of physical or mental self-denial. This is not this kind of pilgrimage. In fact, while asceticism is one of many Hindu paths to what's called moksha, or liberation, and part of what that looks like with liberation is to be released from the cycle of rebirth. So asceticism is one way to get there, but also bhakti and entering into Leela, or divine play, is another form of liberation. It's a way to release the karma that can create attachment and to be fully present with the divine. And in this case, Krishna is who takes that particular form. So participating in Leela leads to Ananda. Some of you may know that term from yoga or other types of practices. It just means bliss. So this is definitely a form of liberation that can happen in this lifetime. It's not even about being released from further lifetimes, which is connected to the Hindu understanding. So it's interesting to move from asceticism to this kind of very intimate form of Ananda that's connected to Hindu mysticism, because there is a sense of not only joy, but there's a sense of love at the center of this form of relationship that really gets played out in so many ways. Like along this path, you get to visit Radha's home, who's that special cowherdess that he spends time with. You get to see where they met each other in the middle of the night to basically swim, kind of have a night swim. So there's all these lovely stories that are connected along the path. And it's not that the devotees, the pilgrims themselves are engaged in the same activities, but when they move through that land and that space, you actually envision and visualize and enjoy that divine play. And so that's your way of participating with that. Many saints have taken this pilgrimage path and written about it. And so a lot of people from different Hindu groups who are connected to Krishna would often maybe imitate the actions of those saints along their own pilgrimage. So there's layers of traditions that are going on with Leela. Most pilgrims will engage, though, in certain practices such as fasting, bathing. In some of the ponds they will bathe, but also just giving offerings along the way and telling stories of Krishna to each other. So it's really very much a joyful kind of pilgrimage experience. I think I will pass it back to Sarah at this point for a second question.
Great, thanks, Kate. All right, so this brings us to our second question. In what ways do long trails reflect the history, culture, and or religions, of the land and region? And again, just like last time, feel free to submit your responses in the chat. Some other things I like to keep in mind with this question are, what aspects of physical geography in that area might shape that, and was the long trail built on existing trails? What kinds of histories and cultures coexist on the same trail? And maybe you all have some experience along the Appalachian Trail. I know some sections that I've hiked have included some history about the Civil War battle sites or Revolutionary War sites. Trails have always been a place of cultural convergence. Okay, so Mindy says, I love the shared human experience of pilgrims despite different spiritual and religious backgrounds. Delia says, sometimes they also reflect the economy as well as with the AT. Great. Yeah, history is a big part of these trails, and I'm going to go ahead and get into some history that is featured along the Shinetsu Trail. So this is a photo of some beech forests, also known as buna in Japanese, along the Shinetsu Trail. These are very important to the trail because, honestly, without them, this trail probably wouldn't exist. And it's actually the reason why that Kato Noriyoshi first visits Iyama in the first place, is because he hears that there's a local conservation movement to protect these beech forests that were in danger of being logged. And what comes out of this movement is a successful movement that saves these beech forests. And to this day, there's a local conservation group called Mori no Ie that now houses the Shinetsu Trail Club headquarters. But the reason why the beech forests are so important is because they help retain water from snow melt that the region experiences. This region experiences so much snow. I've seen photos of many feet of snow that they get in the winter, and these beech forests have the ability to retain the snow melt and release the water down the hillside, where it can then irrigate the farms below their crops. And so that pattern of sustainable land use is actually called satoyama in Japanese, sato referring to village, yama referring to mountain. And so that's an essential part of why the Shinetsu Trail exists, is because people have had that long history of sustainable land use through this satoyama relationship and the beech forests. Some other aspects of history along the Shinetsu Trail. Below you see this historic provincial marker made out of stones. So before there were the Nagano and Niigata prefectures, there were actually the Shinano and the Echigo provinces. And so these stone markers you can find along the Shinetsu Trail. And they actually, when the Shinetsu Trail was founded, they actually scouted out for these stone markers that go back hundreds of years. And so the name of the Shinetsu Trail actually is derived from these two provinces' names. The Shin and Shinano and Etsu and Echigo make up Shinetsu. So because of this history of these two provinces being next to each other, connected by this mountain range, a lot of people from both sides traded with one another. And so there are actually places along the trail where there were historic trading posts. If you look at a map of the Shinetsu Trail, you can see things like Tomikura Gap. In Georgia, you might think of like Woody Gap or Neal's Gap. And in this case, Tomikura Gap refers to a historic trading post. And so because of that, this region has a long history of exchange between those two areas. And lastly, to the left here, another thing that I saw while hiking the Shinetsu Trail was a small stone altar, and in Japanese this is called hokora. And again, this is a difference that we'll talk more about, I'm sure, in this presentation today. But one thing that is different about the Shinetsu Trail compared to other pilgrimage trails that exist in Japan, such as the Shikoku Pilgrimage Trail you all may have heard of, the Sekida Mountains are much lower in elevation compared to mountain ranges that have pilgrimages in them in Japan. And so that's part of why people historically were able to trade with one another. But you do still have these sightings of these small stone altars. And so I think they're a good window into the mixture of Buddhism and Shintoism that is very much a part of Japanese culture that is also very related to the environment and especially these mountains. So this is something that you'll see particularly in rural mountainous regions like the area that the Shinetsu Trail runs through.
All right, thanks, Sarah. We'll go back to India. I hope you all are tracking back and forth okay, but let us know in the chat if it's getting confusing. I want to start with Helen's comment about the Camino in terms of how the trail kind of served as a boundary between Christian-owned land and the Moors. In India, it's so interesting with pilgrimages that rarely is there kind of a boundary. Rather, it's more like a layering on top of each other of different religious histories. So depending upon what kind of religious background you have, you might engage with the land and what's on the trail in very different ways. So for example, in Sri Lanka, at the top of a mountain, there is a footprint that's in the stone. And the Buddhists say it's the Buddha's footprint, and the Muslims actually say it's Adam's footprint, and there's a whole history around that. And then you also have the Hindus saying it's Shiva's footprint, and they all have stories connected to that landing onto that top of the mountain. So you see that also with the Braj Yatra. In general, you're going to have a whole landscape of there's rivers, there's the Yamuna River, there's several forests, there's small little sacred groves, there's plains, there's muddy fields, ponds, mountains. And so all of those have that layering of history and really do shape, like in particular, if you are a Hindu devotee on the Braj Yatra, particular stories will be prevalent. So I'm wanting to show you a picture here on the slide of Mount Govardhan. So you'll see the mountain itself geographically on the bottom, but on the top, you'll see a painted kind of version of the story with Krishna. And so what most Hindus, and by the way, Hindus also often have multiple stories about the land too. It's not just any single story. So you get really used to plurality and navigating all of that and enjoying that. So in this particular case, Krishna is in blue and he's holding up the mountain with his little finger, actually, as part of the story. So it makes it look playful. So think about Leela, that this is easy for him. And he's holding it up kind of like an umbrella, and under it are all the villagers and the cows. And he's doing that because there's another god by the name of Indra who has sent a torrent of rain to try to flood out the village. And there's a whole backstory to that as well. And so in some ways, Krishna is seen as saving the village from being flooded out through creating this umbrella with Mount Govardhan itself. So when pilgrims come to this part of the trail, they actually will circumambulate and circle the entire mountain. So you'll see, they're not only circling all of Braj, but then they'll circle individual temples and mountains and particular trees along the way. So there's a lot of multiple kind of circle, like nesting of circles. So they will circle the mountain as a form of honor. And there are little shrines along the way, much like what Sarah showed with the altars that are within the Japanese tradition, very small, simple altars that people might leave offerings to, that pilgrim guides often will tell stories about what happened at that shrine. There are people who will actually take this to more extreme lengths, literally, by circling this mountain, by taking 108 what we call prostration. So they'll get down on the ground, and they'll put their full body out and with the hands over their head on the ground, and then they'll come back, and they'll do that 108 times, and then they'll take that step to the top of where their fingertips had been and do another 108 prostration. So it takes them usually several days to complete this prostration. It's very physically rigorous. Some people who have mobility issues might actually also use bullock carts that are drawn by kind of farming, really large farming animals in the area. So sometimes you get walkers, you get people on carts. So lots of different transportation methods too. And for a long trail conversation, that may feel like it's not okay to take a bullock cart, but when you're a pilgrim, they kind of give some flexibility with that too. All right, so I think I am going to send us to the next question here. We want to know a little bit about who provides the initial funding, usually for and ongoing stewardship of a long trail. Like, who's often involved in the trails that you have studied or walked yourself? See what we can see what different types of stewardship and funding is happening. So I'm seeing some really helpful responses here. So sometimes it is the actual lovers of the trail. Thanks, Susie, for that comment. We've got different land management agencies, and that can be nonprofit, government, all sorts of different associations. In some ways, sometimes communities get together to really intentionally fund repairs to trails, exactly, NGOs, so many important ways that these trails really need a lot of care and attention, because they often get, at least with the Braj especially, they get a lot of use. And so there's a lot of people moving through there, especially at certain times of year. So that kind of care is important. I'm going to pass this to Sarah to talk a little bit about initial funding and stewardship for the Shinetsu Trail first.
Great, thanks, Kate, and thanks everyone for your responses. And I was really glad to see so many of you responded with some combination of places helping steward these trails. And so if we could go to the next slide. This is where the influence of the Appalachian Trail was particularly great on the Shinetsu Trail. So when Kato Noriyoshi and other members of the Shinetsu Trail Club came to Georgia and North Carolina to meet with ATC representatives and other trail affiliates, one of the things they learned about in great detail was this cooperative management system that both the Appalachian Trail and also now the Shinetsu Trail uses in its management. So that, and you can see from this great graphic here, you see three entities. You have a regional entity like the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. You have national entities like the national parks, Forest Service, and you also have more locally based community organizations. And so those might be local to the region, they might be even local to an AT community. And so the Shinetsu Trail also uses that as its model for trail maintenance and care, working with the national, state, and regional levels. And so you see here to the right, I took a photo of some trail maintainers who I worked with. These are local volunteers participating in trail maintenance. They come from the prefectures that the Shinetsu Trail passes through, the Nagano and the Niigata prefectures. And I think that's something that the Shinetsu Trail Club realized was key to the long-term preservation of the trail, was that people, local people, and also people from further out too. I mean, there are people from Tokyo who would take the car or train to where the Shinetsu Trail is to help maintain it. That level of care and stewardship is essential to the longevity of the trail. And so clearly the Appalachian Trail is a successful example of that, and the Shinetsu Trail strives to do the same in its stewardship. And some other concepts that are related to stewardship of the trail, leave no trace is actually a designation that the Shinetsu Trail has, and I know that they promote that. It's a concept that I think existed without necessarily that title per se well before that, but they also use that as a designation to help promote that ethic on the trail, and as one of its purposes, conservation of the environment in the area. Shinetsu Trail Club also has an established conservation fund for people to donate to, and particularly in Japan, I think, where I think philanthropy isn't quite as common as it is here. It's helpful to have these sorts of designated funds where people might think to donate and conserve the natural environment that the Shinetsu Trail passes through. So I think that wraps it up from my end. Back to Kate.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So with a pilgrimage trail that began in the 16th century, it follows a pretty common pattern in India. India at that time was ruled by several small little local principalities. So there'd be small Hindu rulers, so very localized kinds of things, until you get the advent of a little bit more centralization of power under the Mughal emperors. So these are emperors that, especially the Emperor Akbar, who happens to coincide with the time of Narayan Bhat. Akbar is in Delhi. He is the third Mughal emperor, and had by that point had really established very much a strong network of connections across these small rulers. Some of them were Hindu and some of them were Muslim, because there had been people who either immigrated in from Persia along with the Mughal emperors. In fact, the history of Islam in India has several waves to it, and this is really the second major wave. And so it's bringing all of the types of Islam that's coming from a Turco-Mongol kind of perspective. When the Mongols actually took over Persia and became rulers there, they then also began to transfer over to India. So you get this very strong Perso-Islamic kind of connection with Akbar. And Akbar is known for being extremely open to other religions, other ideas. He would host in his ministerial cabinet people from all sorts of different religious and denominational perspectives. And really, he reigned for 50 years. So he really had a significant kind of impact on India at the time. One thing to know about major rulers, whether you were a local ruler or you were as big as the Mughal Emperor Akbar, is that one of the things that you were expected to do as a ruler was to create kind of patronage for particular religious sites. So religious sites would depend on that type of government level support. And it would create these really interesting relationships. Like if you ever go to old temples, whether it's Buddhist monasteries, Jain sites, you'll see all these plaques about which king donated which parts of the building. And, that patronage tradition is really strong. So under Akbar is when he actually helped to fund several parts of the smaller temples, as well as the larger main temple in Vrindavan that's connected to the Braj Yatra. And he did this by providing land revenue grants so that then the income from that land would be given to the temple directly. He abolished a pilgrimage tax by anybody who's on, no matter what religion they weren't going to be charged any fees. And then he also would pass laws and decrees such as protecting animals. And in the case of the Braj Yatra, he particularly named animals that were special and sacred to Krishna. So in the area of Braj, you were not allowed to harm peacocks or harm cows. So in some ways, there's a whole bunch of components connected to rulers, as well as then religious trails and religious sites itself. There is a tale in which Akbar himself visited Vrindavan and got into the Yamuna River and was said to have a vision of Krishna. Now, I'm fairly certain this is a very Hindu perspective rather than a Muslim perspective. And by the way, after Akbar, things kind of declined in terms of Muslim toleration for any kinds of multi-religious kinds of activities. So there's been a lot of back and forth. Today, there's a mix of stewardship going on. You have religious institutions and organizations. You do have devotees themselves who will donate time to take care of the trail. And then you also have major corporations. You have the government involved at times. The current chief minister of this region, who himself is a Hindu yogi or ascetic. So that doesn't prevent you from also running for office. It's all very interesting. He's actually made a plan to expand the trail, an extra 300 miles. He wants to add other trails to it. So we'll see if his plan comes through and he can get the taxes to fund that. So in some ways, this is an ongoing, interesting history of patronage around this trail. All right, I'm going to give us back to Sarah for our fourth and last question.
Thanks, Kate. Super, super interesting, especially for a trail that has as long of a history as the Braj Yatra. All right, so time is flying and we are at our fourth question. So how does history or culture represented along a long trail reflect broader visions of the natural environment? And again, for a question like this, which might seem kind of broad and abstract, I encourage you all to think of this as an image. What comes to your mind when you think of, an environment in Australia or an environment here in the US or wherever you are? I mean, you all are calling in from everywhere, which is awesome. So think about what comes to your imagination when you think of an environment in a particular location. And this is something that, might vary depending on what level, what level lens you're using. Like, for instance, I'm based out of Dahlonega, Georgia, and there's a lot of gold mining history here that definitely gets reflected out into what people think of when they come up to Dahlonega. They think of the University of North Georgia with the gold steeple that was, plated with the gold in the area. And if you explore the area, you might see big rock faces, and that might be from gold mining, and actually miners using dynamite to blow up sections of gold. Anyway, that's a tangent. I see Ryan's responded with showing contrast between rural and urban living, urbanization more similar across the globe, natural environments more diverse. Yes, definitely. So yeah, I'll let people continue to ponder that question. I'm going to go ahead and get into my response to this through the Shinetsu Trail. And if we could go to the next slide. So I wanted to show this bookshelf, which is actually one of Kato Noriyoshi's bookshelf, because I think it's an interesting window into how he sought to connect different places in the Shinetsu Trail, and how that's related to what his vision was for the natural environment. And on the top shelf, there's a lot of books related to Japanese history and language and anthropology. And then on the shelf below, you all can probably decipher some names here. Some of these are in English, some of these are about the Appalachian Trail. You have White Mountain Guide, you have Locke's Two Treaties of Government. He's a very well-read guy. And so anyway, I wanted to bring this into it because, again, this gets at this idea that he saw, Kato really admired the AT because he saw that as a trail that was a historic place of cultural convergence. And so this relates to my initial advice to you all about thinking of images. If you do just a Google search of Japanese natural landscape or American natural landscape, these are some of the images that appear. And I think these are really interesting because they reveal a lot about what we associate or don't associate with a natural environment. And so to the left here, this is a pretty typical image of beautiful landscape with a beautiful shrine. And temples are also common in these sorts of images. And whereas in the American natural landscape, I think this is actually a picture of Yosemite, although correct me if I'm wrong. You have these huge mountains and there's not as much human presence here. And so part of this is related to just Japan's long history of fairly uninterrupted in terms of colonialism, or at least Japan has its own colonial history too, but it's a history that extends for longer back. And so as a result, people associate these historic places like these historic shrines and temples along with the natural environment. And so tourists who come to the Shinetsu Trail, or frankly to many places in Japan, often have this idea that when they're going to a place, they're seeking this image. And so I think it's interesting the way that this interacts with the way that trails like the Shinetsu Trail include history in its own stories that they share with people, and it's something that is related to Japan's interest in World Heritage sites. Being part of UNESCO's World Heritage system is very important to them, both from a cultural preservation standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. So a lot of these aspects of conservation, cultural and natural resource conservation, they're very much braided together. And so that has to do with what people like us who are interested in exploring these different places envision as being part of that natural environment. So that's very much related to our understandings of history and culture that are there too. And I'm gonna go back to Kate here.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to actually just pick up in brief what Helen has put in the chat about opening people's eyes to how beautiful the countryside is despite its history of coal mining. Since this trail started in the 16th century, there have been also waves in which the trail has been completely trashed and destroyed and has to get rebuilt all over again. So there's definitely renewal that goes on, and I'll show a little of that in a moment. So I think all that I want to add in terms of environment is that opening one's eyes. So to see and understand nature as sacred and all the layers that entails, that it's not just in any single one way, is very prevalent within Hindu perspectives. In this particular case, the land of Braj, and then every single other component, whether it's the mountain or the ponds or the forests, are also considered to be the body of Krishna. So you get these kind of multiple layers of sacred embodiment that happen all at the same time. So Krishna is the entire landscape, but also the mountain within the landscape. There's a great festival where people offer to feed the mountain because it's considered to be a form of Krishna once a year. And then, of course, all the other stories about Krishna and his interactions with Radha. So in some ways, the sacrality of the environment gets amplified as part of the pilgrimage tradition. And then just a quick note about where the trail is at the moment in terms of ecotourism. There's definitely encouragement to make sure you're using offerings that are friendly to the environment, that would not pollute the environment. So less plastic or no plastics, no metals, things that would be organic and would dissolve, dyes that aren't going to pollute. You also have organizations like the Braj Foundation, which is a very well-funded foundation that has done some major renovation work in some of the groves and ponds and areas, but also a little bit of very India tourist kind of approach, which you see in the bottom right corner, where they've kind of reenacted the Govardhan scene. And so it looks a little bit like if you were on one of the rides at Disneyland or something, but it's that's very much valued within Indian aesthetics, is to kind of have some of those more, what some of us might see as a little cheesier kinds of components. But it's a way for devotees to interact. So you can see kind of the pristine nature of some of these kind of touch points or spots, but not all of the trail looks like this. It also can be very wide open with just trails and plains and ponds. So in some ways it's a mix of the two.
Any questions? And this is a great time to take yourself off mute too.
I have a question. I found that when I walked Camino de Santiago, the fact that I'm not Catholic sort of didn't matter. I felt everybody had this sort of sacred purpose. People were following their own, spiritual path, and it was really powerful. And I'm wondering, on the Shinetsu Trail, how important would it be to have a sort of access to those religious traditions, as well as for the trail you talked about in India?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Delia. And I think this is something that is always really good to know about the different religions that are part of an area, because they can be quite unique to that region even. And I think from my experience hiking the Shinetsu Trail, there is a lot that was unique to I think experiencing or seeing, things like the hokora, the small altars, that were specific to rural areas that I found really interesting. And this is not an area that I focused so much in my research of the Shinetsu Trail, but that I learned outside of that, which is that those sorts of altars represent really interesting mixtures of Buddhism and Shintoism, and also, even earlier forms of faith, like this mountain-based faith. I wrote down the name of it. Sangaku Shinko. And so that's more of a mountain-based spirit that's slightly different from Shintoism too. But they're related to each other because there are these different aspects of them where, Buddhism might come in later on and be able to fit quite well with certain aspects of like that mountain-based tradition or Shintoism. And so I think that when you're passing through an area like that, it's really great to learn more about, I think, just how much mixing goes on, at least in Japan's case with faith. I think that's something that's particularly different with different religions that might be represented in the United States, for instance. But I think going in, with at least an awareness that different religious traditions in Japan do mix a lot depending on the cultural context or the cultural event, I think is the most key thing, at least from my experience of being in Japan. It's not quite as, somebody might not be just Buddhist or just Shinto, depending on the occasion, there might be different traditions practiced.
Yeah, I would also just add that there are plenty of people who don't identify as Hindu. There's a very much an openness on the Braj Yatra. And I think part of that's related to somewhat Hinduism is pretty, I realize that everything I say about Hinduism, and that's what I tell my students all the time, is like one Hindu will say, yep, that makes sense. And another Hindu will say, nope, not me. So it's really hard to generalize, but I would say that there is a sense of mostly openness, that people are coming from all walks of life, and that people are welcome to engage in the Leela, even if that person might not see Leela as their primary lens. So I think that's part of what's interesting about spending time in India.
If I could ask a question, on the Camino de Santiago, as you guys probably know, there's a lot of infrastructure to support pilgrims in terms of lodging and food and whatnot. And I'm curious if you could, speak a little bit to like that side of it for these trails. Is there an infrastructure in place, and what is that like?
Yeah, thank you, Mindy, for asking that question. And that's something that I would have loved to have gone into more depth for today's presentation, and only have so much time, so I'm glad you're asking it here. And the Shinetsu Trail, this actually relates kind of to our earlier discussions of ecotourism. The Shinetsu Trail is built in a way where you can experience it in a lot of different ways. So when I hiked it, I was camping at campsites that are designated along the trail. There are some shelters, or actually, I guess not technically a shelter. I'm remembering a building that existed, but I don't think I camped in the building. I think I camped outside of it. Anyway, so it's designed with backpackers in mind, but it's also designed for people who might not be as interested in camping, but there are actually several lodges along the Shinetsu Trail, or just a short walk off of the Shinetsu Trail. And I stayed at a couple of those as well during my hike, and they're very, very nice. And I think especially for international tourists who come in, I know those are very popular with them. And so I'm remembering the last campground that I stayed at. It was a campground that wasn't a campground that the Shinetsu Trail built, or a campsite. It was a campground. So I actually finished my hike on a weekend, and I think it coincided with close to the beginning of a holiday there, and so there are a lot of families camping out there as well. And so I came out with my pack and totally sweaty, just with my tent. But I think it's interesting to see how, existing campgrounds like that can also serve hikers that might be passing through on the Shinetsu Trail as well.
Yeah, timing matters so much, Sarah. I've experienced that myself in different situations where all of a sudden other families or other groups are in the hotels and hostels. So it's interesting to see where you intersect. I would say, Mindy, that's a great question. The infrastructure is huge around this. There's a lot of it's interesting to think about religious tour companies of sorts that will put together full packages that will line up all the different, there are hostels. There's often a lot of tent camping along the way, but you can actually, hire a company to do the setup along the way, depending upon your comfort level around all that. You'll also get individuals and couples who have wanted to do the trail for a long time and will just do a solitary kind of excursion and do that themselves. But you really get, there's hostels, there's camping, there's also transportation to and from the major cities of Delhi and Agra and Jaipur. And then of course, you've also got all the what they call catering, so food along the way. Oftentimes people will hire a cook to accompany a big group of Hindu pilgrims, and that cook will make all the meals along the way. So in some ways, whatever infrastructure level you want, you can get, also depending on your economic resources. So you can do this trail very luxuriously, if you will, and is not very ascetic in terms of kind of minimizing and simplifying. But then you also get that one lone ascetic or yogi who is doing those 108 prostrations and, is maybe eating only, berries or things that people are giving to them. And so in some ways you get the full range of infrastructure possibilities. And especially with the Braj Foundation, they're making these big hotels at this point along, in some ways they got to move them far enough off the trail to not disrupt the experience of the trail. But there is a sense of capitalism creeping in further and further at this point. So
Thank you both. That was really helpful.
This adventure series was in honor of AAPI, which is Asian America Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I think that this was an incredible way to highlight these traditions by showcasing other long distance trails throughout the world. So thank you to our expert presenters that came and helped us celebrate this heritage. A huge round of applause for Kate and Sarah. We value your time. Thank you so much. And everyone, I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.